Sebastian.
Oh, how are you?
Can you hear me?
Very low volume.
Oh, just give me a second. So let me just mute this music. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very quietly though.
So is better now?
Now it's better, yeah.
Okay, it doesn't matter. So the important thing is we can hear you clearly.
Perfect.
Okay, so why not you share your screen? So let me just stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
I'm going to share this later. Okay. Okay, it works.
Perfect.
All right, so yeah, so let me just share my screen. So I'm going to give you your screen so later.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure. Do I need to stop sharing?
No. So yeah, because I'm the host.
Okay.
All right. How's everything?
Good. Thank you. How are you?
Very good. So let's just wait like usually. So we wait till like 12 o'clock. So let me see, where's my clock? Yeah. So we still have a few minutes.
Okay. I also invited my co-author Colin, who is also one of your old students. So I hope it was okay.
Oh, okay. Absolutely. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So Collins, did you take my class? I don't remember.
I did, yeah.
Okay. Okay, it's been a while.
Yeah.
So if you guys don't mind, so maybe we can hang around a little bit so after the seminar, because basically, so once the event finish, you just wait, and then so we can have a quick meeting.
Okay, sure.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. So now let me just start the music, and then so wait, everyone's coming. All right.
Okay.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your coming. So as usual, so we are going to have our seminar today. Today, we are very glad to have Sebastian Laumer from University of Illinois. He is going to talk about government spending between active and passive monetary policy. So again, as usual, the ground rule is, so if you have any question, feel free to send through chat. So Sebastian, it's up to you whether you want to answer the question in the middle or you wait toward the end, right? So the reason why we have this rule is because Zoom sometimes the connection is not good. So it's better for everyone just send their questions through chat, and then so you can pick up the question immediately or wait toward the end. All right. Okay. So now let me just leave the floor to you. So let me stop sharing and you sharing for us.
All right.
Okay.
All right, cool. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It is a great pleasure to be here. And I also would like to thank Sigang for the invitation. I'm one of his old students, so I really appreciate this opportunity. Today, I'm going to present to you my job market paper between active and passive monetary policy. This project is joint work with Colin Phillips, a fellow graduate student at the University of Illinois, and he is also one of Sigang's old students. So the key question that we have in mind in this paper is how the government spending multiplier, which is the key object of interest in macroeconomics, depends on monetary policy. And before we start, I'm happy to take a question in the middle of the presentation. So the effect of government spending on the economy has been a major research topic in macroeconomics for a long time. And the primary object of interest in this literature is the government spending multiplier. The government spending multiplier measures the change in output in response to a $1 increase in government spending. And then the central question of this in this literature is about the size of the government spending multiplier, whether the government spending multiplier is larger or smaller than 1. And related to that, the question about how effective government spending is as a policy tool. And despite a lot of research in this direction, the literature has not reached a consensus. Different theories provide opposing predictions, and empirical studies reach different conclusions as well. However, there's this one thing that the literature agrees on, and that is that monetary policy is a key determinant of the government spending multiplier. And in this direction, there exists the conventional wisdom in the literature that says that the multiplier depends on how the central bank responds to inflation and is larger when monetary policy accommodates inflation. So questions about the interactions between government spending on the one hand and monetary policy on the other hand has become an important research topic in macro by itself, especially since the Great Recession. So during the Great Recession or during the 2008 financial crisis, we could see how fiscal and monetary authorities worked together to fight the Great Recession. We could see how central banks in many countries cut interest rates to 0 and how governments implemented economic stimulus packages that were unprecedented by that time. However, questions about the interaction between government spending and monetary policy are currently more relevant than ever, as we can see again how central banks and governments work hand in hand to limit the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how does this conventional wisdom work? We do know that if the government increases its spending, then output and the price level both increase. But then theory says that the overall effect of government spending depends on how central bank responds to inflation. So on the one hand, if monetary policy is active, which means that the central bank raises nominal interest rates more than 1-to-1 to inflation, the real interest rate increases. And a higher real interest rate will then lead households to decrease their consumption. Because consumption is the largest component of GDP in many countries, output will increase, but it will increase less than government spending, so that the corresponding multiplier is smaller than 1. In contrast, if monetary policy is passive, then we have the exact opposite. the central bank reacts only weakly to inflation. That lowers the real interest rate, and a lower real interest rate will induce households to increase their consumption. As a result, in this scenario, the multiplier is expected to be larger than 1. So here in this sub-question about government spending, we have the clear predictions that the government spending multipliers are either larger or smaller than 1, conditional on how the central bank responds to inflation. So now what Colin and I realized when we reviewed the theoretical part of the literature, we noticed that this conventional wisdom is partly based on strong identifying assumptions. So the DSTE models that work in this literature, they impose assumptions that result into a specific monetary policy scenario. First, those models, they only distinguish between active and passive monetary policy. So they ignore or they enact potential differences within those regimes. Then a subset of the literature employs the Markov switching approach to model policy changes. So the nice thing about these papers is that you can see when monetary policy is active and when monetary policy is passive. But this Markov switching approach implies that the central bank jumps randomly from one policy regime to another if the central bank changes its policy. And then finally, and most importantly, all these models, they treat the monetary policy regime as constant when they estimate the effect of a government spending shock. So this assumption implies that the central bank itself cannot change its policy regime after a shock, but is assumed to stay consistently active or consistently passive. And by doing so, the literature assumes that the central bank does not change its policy regime in response to increasing inflation, upcoming recessions, or extreme events like the COVID-19 pandemic, something that you would expect the central bank to do in the real world. So the key goal of this paper now is to analyze the relationship between the multiplier and monetary policy, assigning as much weight towards the data as possible. And to do that, we're going to develop a methodology that allows us to analyze this question empirically without imposing those restrictions. So we're going to estimate a flexible nonlinear VAR model with Bayesian methods. In this case, the Bayesian methods are going, the data I'm going to be informative about the evolution of the monetary policy regime, which is kind of the backbone of our multiplier analysis. And when we do that, we will find that the monetary policy regime behaves differently from how theory models it. So we're going to show that monetary policy regime is not just active or just passive, but evolves continuously over time, which means that monetary policy is not just black or white, but there are many shades of gray, or even within the active and within the passive regime, there are still differences in terms of how active and passive monetary policy can be. And then most importantly, we are going to show that if the central bank changes its policy regime, it changes its policy regime endogenously in response to economic conditions. So we will show that the Fed has increased nominal interest rate in response to high inflation, and it has lowered nominal interest rate in response to economic recession. So the big question now is, how do these new insights about monetary policy affect the government spending multiplier? Most importantly, when we know that the central bank changes its policy regime endogenously in response to inflation and recessions, why should that be different after government spending shock? So why do we need to assume that the central bank just stays constant after government spending shock? Okay? So when we take these insights about monetary policy into account, we will find that the monetary policy regime, or the central bank, responds quickly after a monetary policy regime and transitions fast to an active regime if the initial regime is not already very active. And we will see that this endogenous response of the policy regime has a fundamental impact on the government spending multiplier. Because once we take this endogenous response of the monetary policy regime into account, we find little evidence for a relationship between the multiplier and monetary policy, which contradicts the conventional wisdom in the literature. And we argue that the conventional wisdom in this literature is not a genuine feature of the data, but it's driven by this constant regime assumption and vanishes once this constant regime assumption is relaxed. Okay? Then in the second exercise, we're going to estimate a linear VAR model for the zero lower bound period. So we know that between 2008 and 2015, the Fed kept nominal interest rates at 0, and by doing that, it did not adjust its policy regime after a shock. And this requires us to analyze the multiplier at the 0 lower bound separately from previous monetary policy periods. And then what we see is that once we identify the government spending shock using sign restrictions on impulse response functions, rather than more standard identification approaches, we find that the multiplier at the 0 lower bound exceeds 1, and by this, it is estimated to be larger than it is previously estimated in the literature. Okay, so now we see that there are a couple of questions, so let me see. Okay, let me postpone the question to the end of the presentation, because I think there are a couple of comments right now, and I want to move on. Okay, so this is the roadmap of the presentation. So first, I'm going to walk you through the methodology. Then I will present to you our main results, and then I will present to you our multiplier estimate at the 0 lower bound, and then I will finally conclude. So in this paper, we're going to use the smooth-transition VAR model that has been popularized by Auerbach and Gortnichenko in their famous 2012 paper, where they analyzed whether the government spending multiplier depends on the business cycle. And this model can be characterized by these 4 equations, which I will walk you through each of them now. So first, we're going to assume, according to this model, that our model economy xt, which is the vector of endogenous variables, and we will see later on what these variables are, evolves as a convex combination of 2 extreme monetary policy regimes. So our economy evolves as a convex combination when monetary policy is purely active and when monetary policy is purely passive. Okay? So in each period, we assign the weight G towards the purely passive and the weight 1 minus G towards the purely active monetary policy regime. And each of those pure regimes is characterized by its own coefficient matrix, so that the coefficient matrix of the monetary policy in period T is just a linear combination of these 2. Okay. So as I said, we model our economy as an evolving mix of 2 extreme monetary policy regimes, where we assign the weight G towards the purely passive monetary policy regime. And this weight G is not constant over time, but follows this logistic function. So according to this function, which we call the transition function, G is monotonically decreasing, it is continuous, and it is bounded between 0 and 1. So the idea of this model is that the underlying state of the economy possibly evolves continuously, and we can approximate this continuous evolution via this evolving mix of these 2 pure monetary policy regimes. So the transition function depends on the transition parameter gamma, the state variable zt. The choice of the state variable is one of the key contributions of this model, which we will discuss in a few slides. And then it depends on the threshold parameter c. So the way this model works now is, if the value of zt moves from below c to above c, then the value of g decreases, and we assign less weight towards the purely passive and more weight towards the purely active monetary policy regime. Or in other words, the higher the weight and the higher the value of the state variable, the more active monetary policy is. Then the speed with which this transition occurs is governed by gamma. So if gamma is close to 0, then this model collapses to a linear VAR model, and no transition occurs, and G is always equal to 0.5. In contrast, if gamma is large, then the model becomes a threshold VAR model, and as soon as ZT surpasses C, we jump directly from the purely passive to the purely active monetary policy regime. In that case, G looks like this. For small values of gamma, the transition between these 2 pure states is smooth. So now the last thing that we have to discuss is the vector of reduced form residuals. So it is a standard assumption in the literature to assume that the vector of reduced form residuals follows a normal distribution with zero mean and a covariance matrix. So the difference between our model and linear models is that our covariance matrix is time varying and also follows this convex combination of the two pure state covariance matrices, omega A and omega P. So now, as in linear VAR models, we face the following identification problem. The residuals don't have an economic interpretation, but macroeconomics theory assumes that these residuals are linear combination of structural shocks, which are not identified, but which we are interested in. And to recover those structural shocks, the researcher has to impose economically meaningful restriction. And we will later see what our restrictions are. Okay. So now one of the things that we are interested in besides the government spending multiplier is the evolution of the monetary policy regime. And because we don't have a really good understanding about how monetary policy evolves over time, we're going to use Bayesian methods to estimate the model. So we're going to employ Bayesian methods to estimate the full posterior distribution of the model. So how do Bayesian methods work? So first, we're going to define prior distributions for all model parameters. This includes the coefficient matrices, the covariance matrices, but also gamma and C. And then we're going to use a multi-move Gibbs sampling algorithm to let the data update our prior beliefs and to estimate the marginal posterior distributions. So the big advantage of the Gibbs sampler is the following. The full posterior distribution or the joint posterior distribution of the model might be unknown or difficult to sample from. The Gibbs sampler breaks the vector of model parameters into subvectors and then samples realizations for each subvector from the corresponding marginal distribution. So while the joint distribution might be difficult to sample from, the marginal distributions are oftentimes known and easy to sample from. So for example, we define a prior distribution for the coefficient matrices because it is a conjugate prior, which means that it has the same form as the likelihood function of the data. We know that the corresponding marginal posterior distribution is also normal. Hence, we can really easily sample from the normal marginal posterior distribution. And then the draws from all marginal posterior distributions approximate the joint posterior distribution of the model. And then once we have done that, we can use the marginal posterior distributions of gamma and C to estimate the posterior distribution of the transition function, and then use that distribution to display the monetary policy regime over time. Okay. So one of the key ingredients of this model is the state variable ZT. The state variable determines the nonlinear state that we are interested in. So the standard approach in this literature is to choose a single observable variable as the state variable. So for example, Auerbach and Gortnichenko in their famous 2012 paper, they use output growth to replicate the US business cycle. And then Ramey and Zuberi in their 2018 JPE paper, they use the unemployment rate to also replicate the US business cycle. But monetary policy is not best described by such a single observable variable, so that this standard approach of this model is not optimal in our context. So the question now is, what can we do? So we do know that macroeconomic theory uses the Taylor rule to model monetary policy. And this is a long-lasting tradition in the literature. And according to a simple version of the Taylor rule, the central bank sets its nominal interest rate in response to inflation and in response to some sort of output measure. And if we take a closer look to this inflation parameter, we can build the bridge to the theoretical predictions that I introduced earlier. So this inflation parameter measures the central bank's responsiveness to inflation. So if this parameter is larger than 1, that means the central bank responds more than 1-to-1 to inflation, and monetary policy is active. If this parameter is smaller than 1, then the central bank responds less than 1-to-1 to inflation, and monetary policy is passive. So to bring our analysis as close as possible to the theoretical predictions, we are naturally interested in this inflation parameter of a Taylor rule. So now there is strong evidence in the literature that says that monetary policy varies over time. And for this reason, we're going to estimate a Taylor rule with time-varying parameters. So the description of the Taylor rule remains the same. The Taylor rule, or the central bank, sets its nominal interest rate still in response to inflation and in response to some output measure, but the responsiveness with respect to output or with respect to inflation can vary over time. And this is, again, you can see here, well, we have a subscript T in all the model parameters, but also in the variance of the residuals. So now we assume that all model parameters follow a random walk. This assumption allows for temporary and permanent changes in these model parameters. And with this assumption in mind, we can write this equation here as a state space model. And then we can follow Primicherry 2005 and use Kalman filtering techniques to estimate the value of each model parameter for each quarter of our sample period. And then we use the estimated sequence of the inflation parameter as the state variable for our VAR model. Okay? So that means we have to estimate our model in two steps. First, we estimate the Taylor rule with time-varying parameters, and then use the estimated sequence of the inflation parameter as our state variable. In a second state and a second step, we estimate the smooth transition VAR model, the main part of our model, conditional on our choice of the state variable. So that means our model is different from a standard smooth transition VAR model because we have to include a prior step to estimate the state variable. And for this reason, we call our model smooth transition VAR model with time varying parameters, or in short, TVP-ST-VAR model. And we argue that our model is preferable to the standard smooth transition VAR model if the state of the economy cannot be well described by a single observable variable, as it is the standard approach in this literature, but can be described by a parameter that varies over time, like monetary policy. A few remarks about the data. So for our Taylor rule, we choose the federal funds rate as the monetary policy instrument. And then the central bank sets the federal funds rate in response to inflation and in response to real GDP growth. Okay. In the model economy of our main model includes government spending, government tax receipts, real GDP, Ramey's news shocks, federal funds rate, inflation, and government debt. Two remarks about the data. First, later on, we will allow the central bank to change its policy regime after a shock, which will require us to update the inflation parameter after the government spending shock. And for this reason, we must include all Taylor rule variables also in the VAR. But because our VAR model is already highly parameterized, we have an interest to keep the number of variables as small as possible, which also requires us to keep the Taylor rule as simple as possible. The second remark is that changes in fiscal policy are oftentimes announced before they're implemented, so that economic agents, they can change their behavior before the proposed changes are implemented. And this creates a problem because agents, they change their behavior based on their expectations, which the econometrician cannot observe. So there's a misalignment between the two information set. And in this case, or in this problem, which is called the fiscal foresight problem, the VAR loses its ability to estimate impulse response function or to consistently estimate impulse response functions. The standard approach in this literature is then to include Ramey's news shock as a measure for agents' expectations, and here we just follow that standard approach. So for the main analysis, we truncate the data in the last quarter of 2007. This is also a standard cutoff in the literature to avoid the contamination by your results by the effects of the Great Recession and unconventional monetary policy. And we follow that approach, which means that we exclude the interesting error of the zero lower bound from our main analysis. But in our second exercise, we're going to analyze the government spending multiplier at the zero lower bound. We just do it separately. Okay. So now we are ready to look at the evolution of monetary policy. Okay, so in this graph, we plot the evolution of monetary policy during our sample period using the time-varying weight, 1 minus g, that we assign towards the purely active monetary policy, so that we can interpret this scale as some sort of an index of monetary policy activism. So a value of 0 means monetary policy is very passive, and a value of 1 means that monetary policy is purely active. So what this figure tells us now is the following. So even though there are periods when monetary policy is purely passive and when monetary policy is purely active, there are also many periods in which the policy regime lies in the interior of this unit interval. That implies that monetary policy, according to our model, is not best described by a single observable variable, by two extreme monetary policy regime, but it's better be described as the policy process that evolves continuously over time. So for example, during the late 1950s and the late 1960s, monetary policy was passive, but we can see there are two different degrees of passiveness. And in 1970 and throughout the 1980s, we can see monetary policy was active, but there exist two different degrees of monetary policy activism. Okay? Second, we can also see that if the central bank changes its policy regime, it changes it smoothly rather than abruptly, as it is implied by the Markov switching approach. So for example, following Paul Volcker's appointment as the chairman of the Fed in August 1979, the literature provides an extensive amount of evidence that monetary policies changed fundamentally. And here we can see this change in monetary policy as well. So here following around 1979, we can see monetary policy change from a very passive to a very active monetary policy. But we can also see that this jump, this change in monetary policy is not the jump from 0 directly to 1, but it's actually a change in monetary policy that took 3 years to complete. And then finally, and most importantly, during our sample period, we can identify events where the central bank changed its policy regime in response to economic conditions. So in 1959 and around 1980, the Fed increased nominal and interest rates aggressively in response to high inflation. And then in 1957, 1990, and 2000, the Fed lowered nominal interest rates in response to the corresponding recessions. So we can conclude that the Fed becomes more active during times of high inflation and becomes more passive during times of recessions. So this figure tells us that monetary policy behaves differently from how theory models it. And then the big question is, how do these new insights about monetary policy affect the government spending multiplier? And this is where we are going now. So first, we're going to see that the government spending multiplier is a function of impulse-response function. And impulse-response analysis in nonlinear models, such as ours, is a little bit less straightforward than it is in linear models. So in nonlinear models, such as ours, impulse-response parameter, they depend on the shock sign, the shock size, and the timing of the shock. So that means it may matter whether you consider a positive versus a negative shock or a large versus a small shock. And in addition, in nonlinear models, the state of the economy that you're interested in can react or can respond to changing in conditions during the sample period, as we have already seen, but it can also change after a government spending shock or after a shock in general. And to incorporate these additional features of the model, we follow Coop, Passaran, and Potter, 96, and use generalized impulse response function instead of linear impulse response function. So these generalized impulse response functions are a little bit more complicated to compute. Okay, so the generalized impulse response functions, they require an initial condition, a starting period. And then conditional on this starting period, the generalized impulse response functions simulate two future paths for our model economy. Okay? One, when the economy is hit by a government spending shock, and one when the economy is not hit by a government spending shock. Okay, so conditional on the starting period, we're going to roll the model forward for the next 5 years using the main equation of our model, where we assign the weight 1 minus g towards the purely active and the weight g towards the purely passive monetary policy. Okay, so let's say we're going to roll the model forward for 5 years. And if we then take the difference between these two simulated economies for each period after the shock or after the starting period, we obtain one realization of the generalized impulse response functions. And if we then repeat this exercise for different initial conditions or for different draws of the coefficient matrices, we obtain the distribution of the generalized impulse response functions. Okay? So one last remark about the generalized impulse response functions. When we roll the model forward, conditional on our starting period, it's also likely that the Taylor rule parameter of the inflation parameter of the Taylor rule also changes after the government spending shock, which means that rolling the model forward, it might be possible that the monetary policy regime also changes, which means that for the first equation, you can say that the government spending shock might affect the monetary policy regime in the future, and the changing monetary policy regime will then affect the further transmission of the government spending shock. So how do we do that? So remember that we include all Taylor rule variables also in our model economy. So that means when we forecast our model economy, H periods after the shock, we can also compute the inflation parameter, H periods after the shock. And if we plug in the new value of the inflation parameter into the transition function, we update the weight that we assign towards the purely active and the purely passive monetary policy regime. And these updated weights will then enter the forecasts of our model economy in the next period. So the last question we have to answer is, how do we get from the model parameter, from the model economy to the inflation parameter? And here we are just consistent with the overall estimation of the model. For each period after the shock, we realize the forecasted values of the Taylor rule variables, and then based on those values, we run the Kalman filter, as with the overall estimation of the Taylor rule, and then use the estimate of that Kalman filter as the new value of the state variable, which we will plug then in through the transition function. Okay. So the last thing that we have to consider before we see the main result is that despite using generalized impulse response function instead of linear impulse response functions, we still have to identify the government spending shock. And to identify the government spending shock in this paper, we follow earlier contributions by Mountford and Uhlich 2009 and Canova and Papa 2011 and use sign restrictions on impulse response functions. So in this particular paper, we define a government spending shock as a shock that raises output, inflation, government spending, government tax revenue, and government debt for 1 year, which is the same restricted horizon as in Mountford and Uhlich. And in my 2020 JEDC paper, I argue that this set of restrictions about a government spending shock is consistent with a large class of theoretical models, and hence those restrictions have theoretical foundations. Okay? So the advantages in general of sign restrictions over other approaches are the following. The first of all, sign restrictions are only a weak form of identification, because we only restrict the sign of certain impulse response functions. And then, as I already mentioned, the restrictions that we are imposing are derived from theoretical models. And that's why they have theoretical foundation, which is the big advantage over alternative approaches, which are oftentimes difficult to defend. So I would like to highlight one more time that the restrictions that we are imposing in this paper are joint predictions from theoretical models. So lastly, sign restrictions in linear VAR models have been widely used and are well documented, but sign restrictions on generalized impulse response functions are new to the literature. And Colin and I, we have a paper where we implement, or where we found a way to implement sign restrictions on generalized impulse response functions, And I'm happy to share the details if the time allows. Okay? So now we are coming to the main exercise to analyze whether the government spending multiplier depends on monetary policy. So in this question, we are interested in how the impact of a government spending shock depends on monetary policy, while monetary policy itself might change after the shock. And for these circumstances, we have to take three things into account. So first of all, we have to take into account the direct effect of the shock on the variables. Then, because monetary policy might change after the shock, we also have to take into account the indirect effect of a shock that occurs through changing monetary policy. And because we are interested in how the monetary policy, how the government spending multiplier depends on different initial conditions, we also have to take into account the initial condition of the shock. Okay? And as it turns out, our methodology allows us to incorporate all these attributes. So we're going to estimate our model, and then we're going to use generalized impulse response functions to estimate the dynamic effect of a government spending shock. So remember, the generalized impulse response functions require an initial condition, which means we can estimate the government spending multiplier for each monetary policy regime during our sample period. So here we make our life a little easier and divide the initial monetary policy regimes into quintiles and compare the multiplier when monetary policy is very active, weakly active, neutral, weakly passive, and very passive. Second, the generalized impulse response functions will allow the central bank to change its policy regime after the shock, and this way we can see how this will affect the government spending multiplier. So then if we take these attributes into account and theory is still correct, we should expect the multiplier to be larger when the initial monetary policy regime is passive. Okay? So what have our results something to say about this? So in this first graph, I'm going to show you the response of the monetary policy regime after a government spending shock. So here I show you the response of the weight that we assign towards the purely active monetary policy regime, 1 minus G, and how it evolves after a government spending shock. So if the initial regime is very active, then we can see there's not much of a change. If the initial monetary policy regime is already very active, then it also stays active. However, if the initial regime is not already very active, but it's neutral or very passive, then we can see that the central bank responds quickly and transitions fast to a more active regime, so that shortly after the shock, and regardless of its initial condition, the central bank responds actively to inflation. So this graph tells us that these assumptions that, or impulse response functions that keep the policy regime constant after a shock are difficult to reconcile with the data, especially when the initial policy regime is passive. Now the big question is, how does this endogenous response of the policy regime affect the government spending multiplier? And as it turns out, it has a fundamental impact on the multiplier. In this graph, I'm going to plot the distributions of the multipliers according to the initial conditions in the short run, in the medium run, and in the long run using box plots. So if the theoretical consensus is still correct, and even though it takes the endogenous response of the policy regime into account, we should see the box plots shift up for the more passive regimes. So what do our results have to say about this? So 1 quarter after the shock, we can see that the box plots are, that there's not a lot of variation in the box plots with respect to the initial monetary policy regime, so that the government spending multiplier does not seem to depend on the multiplier 1 quarter after the shock. Okay? 1 year after the shock, we can see that the box plots, they move down a little bit, but if we compare the box plots across the initial monetary policy regime, we still don't see a lot of variation. And 5 years after the shock, we can see even further how the box plots shift down. but with respect to its initial monetary policy regime, there's still not a lot of variation. So this figure tells us that the government spending multiplier decreases over time. So the posterior median is around 5.5 after 1 quarter, and then it decreases over time. But within each time period, there's no variation or not a lot of variation with respect to the initial monetary policy regime. Okay? So that lets us conclude that the conventional wisdom in this literature is not a genuine feature of the data, but it's primarily driven by the constant regime assumption and vanishes once this constant regime assumption is relaxed. Okay? So this is our main exercise. So now we're going to analyze the multiplier at the zero lower bound separately from previous monetary policy regimes. Why do we do that? So as I said, in the previous exercise, we truncated the sample period in 2008 to avoid the contamination of our results by the effects of the Great Recession and by the effects of the unconventional monetary policy. However, we also know that between December 2008 and November 2015, the Fed held nominal interest rates constantly at zero, which means that the Fed did not change its policy regime in response to economic conditions, even though the government had implemented unprecedented economic stimulus packages like the Troubled Asset Relief Program or the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So these circumstances require us to analyze the multiplier at the zero lower bound separately from previous monetary policy regimes. In particular, we need to keep the monetary policy regime constant after the shock, which we didn't do in the previous exercise. Okay? So since 2008, the multiplier at the zero lower bound was at the center of the policy debate. And despite a lot of research, the literature has not come to any consensus. So different theories make opposing predictions about whether the government spending multiplier is larger or smaller than 1 at the zero lower bound. And empirical studies reach different conclusions as well. So for example, Alumnia and others 2010, and Gordon and Crenn 2010, they analyzed the multiplier at the zero lower bound during the Great Depression and find that the multiplier is around 2. Ramey and Zuberi in their 2018 JPE paper, and Miyamoto and others 2018, they analyzed the multiplier at the modern zero lower bound in the US and in Japan, and they find that the government spending multiplier is below 1. Okay, so there's still a lot of debate in the literature. So what do? So we estimate a linear VAR model for the period between 2008 and 2015 with the same variables as before, except we replace the federal funds rate with the Wu and Shaw shadow rate. So during the zero lower bound, the federal funds rate is just constantly 0, so it doesn't exhibit a lot of useful information. Whereas the Wu and Shaw shadow rate is just the continuation of nominal interest rate and becomes negative during the zero lower bound era. And then we're going to compare the multipliers from this linear VAR model with the corresponding multipliers from the purely active and the purely passive monetary policy regime. Okay. So in this first exercise, we just compare the multipliers between the purely active and the purely passive monetary policy regime. So we estimate our model, and then we use impulse response functions that keep the monetary policy regime constant after the government spending shock. And then the red histogram represents the multiplier when monetary policy is and remains purely active, and the blue one when monetary policy is and remains purely passive. So what we can see here is that in the short and medium one, up to 1 year after the shock, the estimated histograms of the multipliers, they highly overlap, so that in the medium and the short and the medium, then there are no meaningful differences between the multipliers. But then 1 year after the shock, the multipliers start to diverge. And 5 years after the shock, we can clearly see that the blue histogram lies to the right of the red histogram, which means that the multiplier is larger when monetary policy is and remains purely passive. And this replicates the theoretical consensus in the literature that the multiplier is larger when monetary policy is passive. And one thing that I forgot to mention is in this exercise, in this second exercise, we're going to identify the government spending shock with our sign restriction approach, but also with this classical recursive approach, which doesn't seem to matter at this point, but it will matter at the next slide. Okay? So in this slide, we're going to look at the same distributions as before, except we add the distribution of the multiplier from the zero lower bound model. And here you can see why we identify the government spending shock using two different identification approaches. So when we use the classical recursive identification, where we order government spending first, we can see that the corresponding multiplier or the corresponding distribution of the multiplier is centered around 0, which means that the multiplier is small at the zero lower bound. And this is true for the short run, medium run, and in the long run. So the problem with the recursive identification is that when you estimate a government spending shock with this approach and order government spending first, you implicitly assume that government spending is contemporaneously unrelated to the business cycle. Or in other words, you assume that governments change their spending only with a delay. However, we have seen that governments can actually respond quite fast and change their spending plans quite fast during times of crisis. We have seen that during the Great Recession, and we have seen that during the current COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the CARES Act, which is the largest economic stimulus package in the US history, has been proposed, negotiated, and signed into law only in a couple of days. That means governments can change their plans quite fast, but that also means that the timing restrictions related to the recursive approach are violated, at least at the zero lower bound. In contrast, if we use our sign restrictions that have theoretical foundations, we can see that the multiplier is largely positive, not only in the short run or in the medium run. In other words, it's not only positive during the restricted horizon, but also 5 years after the shock. Okay, so that means that while the posterior median following the recursive approach is close to 0, the posterior median of the multiplier following our sign restriction approach is 4.5 on impact and around 3 after 5 years, which tells us that the multiplier at the zero lower bound is likely to be larger than 1, and hence it is larger than it is previously estimated in the literature, which also implies that economic stimulus packages like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act or the CARES Act might have larger economic effects than it was previously concluded in the literature. Right, and this is all I have for today. So the big question that we have in mind in this paper is, how does the fiscal multiplier depend on monetary policy? There exists a conventional wisdom in the literature, but we suspected that this conventional wisdom depends on strong identifying assumptions. And then we develop a new methodology to analyze this question empirically without imposing those restrictions. So we combined a smooth transition VAR model with a Taylor rule that is estimated with time-varying parameters. And then when we allowed the data to become informative about this evolution of monetary policy, we found that the monetary policy regime behaved quite differently from how theory models it. First, we found that monetary policy is not just active or passive, but actually evolves continuously over time. And we found that the central bank changed its policy regime endogenously in response to inflation and recessions. Okay? Then we took these new insights about monetary policy into account when we estimated the government spending shock, and found that the monetary policy regime also changes after the shock. So we saw that the central bank, if the initial regime is not already very active, then the central bank changes its policy regime quickly and transitions fast to an active policy. And then we saw that this endogenous response of the policy regime had a fundamental impact on the government spending multiplier. Once we took this endogenous response of the monetary policy regime into account, we found little evidence for a relationship between the multiplier and monetary policy, while in contrast, when we kept the monetary policy counterfactually constant after the shock, we did find results that supported the conventional wisdom. So that we conclude in this paper, that's kind of the main conclusion, that the conventional wisdom in this literature is not a genuine feature of the data, but it's primarily driven by this constant regime assumption and vanishes once we relax that assumption. And then in the second exercise, we estimated the multiplier at the zero lower bound separately from previous monetary policy regimes, because we know the monetary policy regime stayed constant after 2008, and we had to incorporate this feature into our impulse response functions. And then once we identified the government spending shock using our theoretically justified sign restrictions, we found that the multiplier at the zero lower bound is larger than it was previously estimated. Right? Great. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Sebastian. So I do have some questions, but so your calls already answered most of my questions. So maybe I just wait for other audience to see whether they have a question or not.
Okay.
Yeah. So feel free to ask your question.
Yeah.
So now. Okay.
Maybe you can.
Yeah, maybe you can explain some of the questions.
Okay. So I must apologize. I stopped during the presentation at one point because I saw the chat lighting up, but then I also saw that my co-author was already addressing one. So I apologize if I missed some of your question, but I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you still may have.
No, so maybe you can address a little bit. So like Mark, so he is our senior faculty. So he left early, so he sent me private message. So he had a couple of questions, but I believe Colin's already answered.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, the first question is answered, I think.
Yes, so I did have a couple of like clarified questions. So
okay.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Okay, I'm happy to answer those.
So you can glance through quickly, so because we have time. So if yeah.
Are they in the chat? I'm unfamiliar with the chat, so usually people just interrupt me during the presentation or they ask me after the presentation. So I'm not too familiar with the chat.
So like you have like a clarified questions like toward the end, so you have a graph show the size of the multiplier. But I figure out so that just for $1, so you're going to get like $30 of multiplier, right? But it's to me, so that's a big surprise to me. I saw that like typically it's around a 1 or below 1, but you have like a multiplier close to 4 and 5.
Oh yeah.
The other one, yeah, right, this one. So okay. I had a question regarding to this. So you're saying like a short term. So if you have very active monetary policy, $1 spent, you're going to generate $6.
That is a very interesting question. Yeah. So people typically assume that the multiplier, if you look at the overall the overall literature, typically suggests that the multiplier is between 0 and 3.5. That I think is the consensus. But I think most of the studies, they look at more long-run multipliers. And if you look at the long-run multiplier, we do see we fall into that category.
Okay.
So in my JDC paper, I also look at multipliers in the short run and do find that multipliers in the short run are substantially larger than they are in the long run. That is the first part. The second part, my understanding of the literature is that most of the identification strategies in the empirical part of the literature uses identification strategies that are somehow related to this recursive identification, which I explained earlier. If we repeat the same exercise With the recursive approach, we also do find substantially smaller multipliers. But I hope that the difference between these two approaches became clear. So while using the recursive approach, you assume that governments don't change their spending plans immediately to changes to the business cycle, which can be a strong assumption. And I brought up the zero lower bound exercise period as an example. Our sign restrictions that we are using, they are based on joint predictions of theoretical models. So when we identify the shock with restrictions that we believe we are true, then we find multipliers that are substantially higher in the short run than they are in the long run. So I think maybe to kind of more directly answer to your question, I think the smaller this consensus of having multipliers close to 1 might be the result of looking only at long run multipliers or only at looking at different identification strategies.
I see. All right. Okay, do we have any further questions?
I think we want to say something about that identification strategy.
Okay.
Or something more, right? Because so many people have been using Cholesky or recursive identification since Blanchard and Perotti a long time ago said it was a good idea. And it seemed like a good idea for a long time. When we get into the zero lower bound, specifically this year, what Sebastian said, with the CARES Act, for instance, that they did this spring is one of the largest counter-cyclical fiscal policy packages of any kind anywhere in history. And they waved that thing into existence in just a couple of weeks. And the PPP program, for instance, this spring, started pumping out money in just a couple of weeks and actually ran out of money. And that was hundreds of billions of dollars. So very, very large fiscal policy shocks that clearly violate the Cholesky restrictions. So if we're going to be looking at fiscal policy multipliers and other authors doing the same thing, we should really probably stay away from that recursive restriction in the modern era, because it seems like we're violating it very seriously right now.
Okay.
So we want to put a little bit more weight on these sign restricted estimates and maybe a little bit less weight on the recursive estimates, and maybe the sign restricted estimates are a bit more believable than the Cholesky identification strategy.
Okay. All right. So I guess if there's no questions, so maybe we can just thank Sebastian and Collins for your great presentation.
Thank you very much for having me, or for having us.
Okay, thank you. Good. Thanks for everyone for your coming. So I guess we probably see each other next week. Okay, let me see one message. Thank you. Okay, so all right. Very good.